Hi, everybody. So for those of you who don't know me, I'm Kayla, and like Victor said, this next mini-series is kind of a continuation of our last series about Go and Do Likewise. And so tonight I'm going to be talking about redemptive sufferings, which sounds kind of weird and intense, but hopefully you're not like Ryan Barr and think that you're going to leave here feeling like a bad person because, yeah, I don't know why. He came up to me earlier and was like, I just know that I'm going to leave here feeling awful about myself. I was like, well, I hope that's not the case. But anyway, it's wet. I hope that like you leave here kind of having a better understanding of why we suffer and how we can handle that suffering. And now, this is a really large topic because there's all different kinds of types of suffering. There's physical, emotional, spiritual, mourning, and those are kind of like the big things that like you think about whenever you hear about suffering. But then there's also like the daily occurrences that can add up. And these types of sufferings can last for maybe just a few hours or a day, or it could last up to like a few weeks or months or years. And there's a lot to this, and so I won't be able to touch on everything, but my hope is that through my experiences and kind of what I've learned and read about, that we can get to a better understanding of why we suffer and how we can make it through that. And so to understand a little bit more about how to handle this suffering, let's look at Jesus. And Jesus is fully God and fully human. And I think, for me at least, I sometimes forget that he's fully human because reading through the Gospels, like, it's easy to see how he's fully God with all of the miracles and works that he does and all of his teachings. But the human aspects of Jesus' life are very subtle. And, but like, whenever I think about it, they really kind of blow my mind. And the part that I'm going to focus on is Jesus' passion and death, because it obviously relates to this really like intense suffering that we think about. And the line that sticks out to me whenever I'm reading through the Passion is whenever Jesus is praying in the Garden of Gethsemane, and he breaks down and he is praying so feverishly that he is sweating blood. And he says, "Father, if you are willing, take this cup from me. Still, not my will, but yours be done." And I think that this is just like the perfect kind of like encompassing of how human Jesus really is, because he didn't want to really suffer and go through all of that pain, but then again he knew that he was God and that he had to do it. And so he went through it. And whenever I read through like the trial of Jesus and the carrying of the cross, and whenever he hung on the cross, we know that Jesus absorbed all of the hatred and that was offered to him and exuded peace and love. And I had never really thought about this because like I've been told that like whenever Jesus was going through all of this, that like he thought of us during this, which is true. But I was meeting with Sister Colleen last week, and she had told me to think about like what Jesus was thinking about as he was having to go through that suffering, and how he was probably thinking like, God, why do I have to go through all of this pain? And I think the line that really brought it all together for me was whenever Jesus is on the cross and he cries out, my God, why have you abandoned me?" And throughout this whole time, like, Jesus is thinking this because he is God, and God can do everything. Like, he could have saved us in any way, but he chose to send Jesus to have him suffer and die for us. Like, why? And we can never really fully understand that why, because it's such a huge question, and like we will never be able to fully wrap our minds around it. But through Jesus' suffering and death, it gives our suffering meaning and gives us an example to live by, so that way we can kind of better live our lives through our suffering. And there's many times in our lives where we have this same thought as Jesus, like, my God, why have you abandoned me? Like, why am I going through this? And like I said, there's kind of two different sides of suffering. There's like the really like big, intense suffering that people normally think about, like death or illness or injury or something like that. Then there's also just like the everyday sufferings that can kind of add up. And like I'm sure we've all been there on those days where it seems like nothing goes right. Everyone's against you, like nothing is just going your way, and you just are frustrated. It's like a really long day. And so, for example, a lot of days I go from 9 a.m. to either 8 or 10 o'clock at night, going from one thing to another. I usually get like the luxury of like a 2-hour break like every once in a while, but mostly it's just like hour breaks like scattered throughout. And it's really not that bad, but on those days where it's just really long, it's a really, really long and hard day. But what I try to do to get through these days is try to find God in the hecticness of my day. Try to see like how, like even though I'm running late or really need to do homework and like I'm like busy, I try to stop and see where God is trying to reach out to me and what He's trying to tell me in that day. And it can be hard whenever like I'm going from place to place, and it seems like the concept of like thinking about, how is God acting in my life today? It seems like really complex, but actually it's just as simple as stopping for like 2 seconds and taking a deep breath. And I know whenever I do that, it helps tremendously. And in times like these, it makes me think about this analogy that somebody told me, and how our lives, it's like we're looking at a huge, like beautiful mural or mosaic that's like very intricate, but it's huge, and we are standing like about a foot away from it, and all we see is just this little section that's right in front of us, and we're going, I don't get it. I don't see the beauty of it. Like, I don't get how this is like cool or whatever. But it's because we're focused on this, like just this little section, where if like we kind of step back and see more of it, then we understand like each section is beautiful, and like it's part of the whole, and like it's necessary, even though whenever we're like zooming in on it, it may not seem like we don't understand it. And I know that this happens to me a lot whenever I'm like in a situation and it's just like I don't get it, because especially like in regards to like whenever I'm thinking about my future or like my relationship status. So I'm 21, I'm single, I've never had a boyfriend, and I've only been on one date in my life, and that was really interesting. But I'm not saying that being single is like bad, because I actually really enjoy it sometimes, but at the same time it can be really hard, especially in the society that we live in, whenever people judge you based on your relationships that you've had, who you're dating, or different stuff like that. And it can also be hard whenever I have so many great examples of good relationships through my friends and family, and like I see that and it's like I want that. I'm not jealous of them because I'm very happy for them, but I see that and it's like it just hurts. But that's whenever I'm too focused on the here and now, and I just have to kind of step back and look at that, because it's like I don't get it. I think I'm a great person. Why don't other people see it? But I know that in times like these, I think back to Jesus in the Garden of Gethsemane, and I just have to say, Lord, not my will, but yours be done. Because it's not like, I know that if I'm called to married life, that God will direct me to my future husband in his time and not mine. And so even though there may be like a situation where like I think like, oh, maybe this could be something, and then it doesn't work out, like because that's happened to me, and looking back, like in the moment it really stinks and like it kind of hurts, but looking back I've understood like why that's happened, and like I can see that. And whenever we have those situations, it comes down to a choice. We can either wallow in like our suffering and like what we're going through, or we can choose to trust in God and like know that like there is a purpose for this. And because just like Jesus' suffering, like he suffered a tremendous deal, but because he suffered and died, he then rose and saved us from our, like, now we can go to eternal life. Like, it's fantastic. And so that's kind of like the redemptive suffering part, because like our suffering now has a purpose. And but yeah, so whenever we're in these like hard times and suffering times, we just have to kind of choose to trust in that God has a plan. And to kind of better understand this, Sister Colleen had also told me the story that Father Robert Barron had told, and it was about this little boy who was old enough to understand pain in that concept, but he couldn't understand other stuff. And so he had this like really bad illness to where he could either lose his life or later on down the road have a lot of health problems. But there was a surgery that if he did, it would make him better. And so, of course, his father consented to the surgery at that time. But like, what does the father say to the little boy who looks up at his father in terror and pain, knowing that his father is letting this happen? That if he wanted to, his father could stop this pain, but he's letting it happen anyway. Like, what can the father say to the little boy who can't comprehend that although he's going through so much pain now, it'll actually benefit him later on? And it's the same way with us and with God and us. Like, what we're going through now may be really hard and it's not fun and it really stinks. But God has a plan for that suffering. And the thing about it is that we may not know it. Like, we may not get to see, like, the purpose for our suffering in this life. We may have to wait, but it does have a purpose. And I think for times like these, so I kind of talked about, like, the little everyday sufferings. But I think, like, those kinds, or, like, the suffering that's described in that little story also has a lot of impact on, like, the major sufferings, like with pain and death and illness and stuff like that. And so I want to share a little bit about my family. I've had multiple family friends and family members who have been diagnosed with cancer or stuff of the like. And I've also been to more funerals than I really want to like think about. But my freshman year, and I have a really large family. I am the 16th grandchild on both sides of my family. And my mom's parents are, like, both sets of my grandparents are older, but my mom's parents are older than my dad's. And my freshman year, it was in the fall, my grandma was put in the hospital for a urinary tract infection, which, like, my grandma being in the hospital, like, it was bad, but, like, it wasn't quite unusual whenever I got the phone call, because she was 86 at the time. But the thing about it is that she kept on getting worse, and they did more tests, and they found out that she had lung cancer. And now, my grandma has never smoked a day in her life. We have no idea why she got lung cancer. And her being in the hospital was really rough. She was in the hospital for about a month or so, if not longer, and there was a lot of really hard days. It was really hard on my family, especially my mom, because she was kind of like the main person who took care of my grandparents in that regard. And it was a really hard time because we didn't understand why my grandma had lung cancer. But long story short, she was able to come back home and she got a little bit better. But the diagnosis for her lung cancer was that she wouldn't make it. She only had like a few months to live, and that she wouldn't make it to the holidays. But she ended up pushing through, and we had Thanksgiving together, and then for Christmas, my cousins who live in Minnesota, they normally don't come down for Christmas because it's usually snowing a lot in Minnesota, so it's hard for them to get down. But they came down because we all knew that it would probably be the last Christmas with our grandma. And so anyway, it was about late January, and I was doing laundry and had a question, so I called my mom, of course, and whenever she answered, she sounded very upset, and I just figured something had happened with my grandma. And as she was talking to me, it wasn't my grandma. I had found out that my uncle was killed in a car accident. And it came as a huge shock to our family because my Uncle Roger wasn't very old. He was a very jolly, happy man. And it was really hard. But for the funeral, my entire family came in for the funeral. Like, we are now all spread out in like Minnesota, Texas, Florida, like all around Missouri, but every single one of us was in for the funeral. And it was really, like, that's how we were able to get through it, was because of that support and that love. Like, we helped each other through it. And, like, it's still hard whenever we go to family gatherings and Uncle Roger isn't there to crack a joke or ask you to pull his finger. Like, he's just, like, there's still that part missing, and we don't really understand why. But, like, it's happened, and so we kind of have to move on from that. But on a very positive note, my grandma is still living. So this has now been 3 years ago, and the doctors have no idea why she is still living. She only has one functioning lung, and yet she's doing great. But kind of this last part, the community aspect of how, like, my family was there to help support each other, I feel like that's kind of the key to making it through this suffering. Because a lot of times whenever we suffer, we feel like it's just us on our own. Like, we have to push through. But the thing about it is like, we are never alone in our suffering. And, like, going back through, like, my different examples, like, on those really hard days, like, I usually either see somebody who, like, smiles or, like, is like, oh, hey, how's it going? And, like, cheers me up. Or if they're also having a bad day, we can kind of have, like, a little pity party, and then we feel better. And, like, I have, like, those friends that I call whenever, like, I've, like, just not really having a good day, and, like, they help me through. And, like, whenever we suffer, like, there's always somebody there for us. And even if it seems like there isn't, we can always unite our sufferings with Christ, because he was human. He was here on earth. Like, he's been through everything we've been through and so much more. Like, we can never say that we are alone, because we're not. And yeah, and there's so much more that I could talk about on this subject, because like I said, it's so huge. But like, if you're ever looking for different things on, like, suffering, or, like, if you're going through something, I would really suggest looking at the different lives of the saints, because they have some really amazing stories. For example, like Mother Teresa, St. Maria Faustina, Pope John Paul II, like, they all have, and many, many more, but, like, those are some of my favorites at the time. Like, they just have incredible lives, and, like, so much suffering that, like, but they push through it. And there's also a ton of prayers to help us through. But I want to leave, like, you to leave here knowing that no matter how big or how small the suffering is, like, it matters to God. Like, he doesn't want us to suffer, but he has a plan for our suffering, and that's, like, the redemptive part. And we just have to choose to trust in him, so that way, like, we can make it through. And so I want to leave you with some different quotes that I really liked. One is from St. Maria Faustina, or it's from whenever Jesus spoke to St. Maria Faustina, and he says, "Fear not, all difficulties will serve for the fulfillment of my will." So, although it can be hard to do, whenever we have those bad days, like, we just have to trust that, like, our suffering is for God's will, even though it really stinks at the time. But then I also really like this one because it's simple, and it says, "Happiness is not circumstantial, it's a choice." And so in everything that we're doing, like, it'll be hard at a lot of times, but we have to choose joy, choose, like, getting over it. And it won't be easy, and, like, yeah, but it's just kind of what we have to do. So the next thing that we're going to do is a prayer activity. And so David and the band is going to play a few different songs, and in between songs we're going to have people come up and read different prayers or scripture passages that will help us more understand suffering. And so I really encourage you to take this time and think about the different struggles that you have in your own life. And it's probably a lot different from mine and different from the person that's sitting beside you, but we all have those things in our lives. But we can really use this, like, these sufferings and these hard times, to grow closer to God. Because just like the lost sheep who runs away, like, the good shepherd breaks his leg, but then he carries him on his shoulder. And so he has that time to get to know the shepherd's voice. And so we can use this time of suffering to better grow closer and get to know Christ even more. And so, like, don't see it as an opportunity, or don't see it as, like, this hard time where, like, we have to just get through, but see it as an opportunity to even grow closer to God.